Mr. Dewal, the presidential elections are fast approaching in Azerbaijan. How would you characterize the pre-election environment in Azerbaijan? Do you believe that there's a chance for a free and fair election?
Well, Azerbaijan doesn't have a tradition of free and fair elections. If you read the monitor's reports, everyone really only expects there to be one winner, which is current President Ilham Aliyev. I think it was becoming an interesting election until a few weeks ago with the possible candidacy of Rustam Ibrahimbekov, but it now looks as though his citizenship issues with Russia have not been resolved. We can speculate why. And so he would have been a strong opposition candidate. I think the issue in all of these countries around is that there is discontent, but the opposition, obviously the playing field is not level. The authorities usually win, and also the opposition needs to find a channel, a voice. It's interesting that they managed to do that. Opposition managed to do that in Georgia. We see turbulence all around the region, but we've seen, for example, protests in Turkey against Prime Minister Erdogan, protests in Russia against Putin. But those protests rose and they're now falling again. And I think the Azerbaijani authorities do face discontent. There is opposition, but I think we can only see one result from this election, which is the election of President Aliyev.
All is quiet on the front of the peace talks in Nagorno-Karabakh. The U.S. announced recently the appointment of the former U.S. ambassador to Bulgaria, James Warlick, as the next U.S. co-chair of the OSCE Minsk group. What is your take on the status of the peace talks?
Well, I think the peace talks are very stuck. Everyone in the Minsk group is scratching their heads about what to do next, because basically the so-called Prague process, Madrid principles, that is still on the table, but there's been absolutely no progress over the last 2 years since the meeting in Kazan. So a new envoy, a little fresh energy, but basically the same problems remain. And particularly on the Azerbaijani side, a lot of skepticism about the peace plan that is on the table, and no sense of hurry to agree with that peace plan. I think Azerbaijan thinks it's getting stronger, and as Armenia is getting weaker. I'm not sure I necessarily entirely agree, but Azerbaijan is in no hurry to agree to a peace plan, which would cause the president a lot of headaches domestically if he were to push ahead with a peace plan. So everyone is more or less comfortable with the status quo. However, the aggression on both sides, I think, is extremely strong. I was in Armenia a few weeks ago. I see this. I think the aggression the verbal aggression is very strong also on the Azerbaijani side, and that's dangerous, because it at some point there is the fear that words lead to deeds, and that some kind of aggressive words will lead to some kind of military action.
The Azerbaijani government recently released a blacklist, so-called, of 335 individuals who are banned from traveling to Azerbaijan because they had traveled to Nagorno-Karabakh previously. Your name is not on that list. What would you say about that?
Well, I mean, in general, I'm against blacklists, and particularly against scholars and writers. I think scholars and writers need to be able to travel freely, to ask questions. I think it's healthy for a place like Karabakh to have foreign writers and journalists going there, asking questions and reporting back. I think that helps the world understand what's going on in a place like Karabakh. It helps Azerbaijan understand what's going on in a place like Karabakh. So I don't approve of those blacklists. What I do, and I've been to Karabakh many times, I think it's impossible to write a book about Karabakh without visiting Karabakh itself many times, is that I basically inform the authorities in Baku. I inform the foreign ministry that I plan a visit to Karabakh, so as to let them know. It's a kind of a polite gesture to the authorities in Baku. And then when I go to Baku, I tell people what I've seen there, and I think they find it interesting. That's worked for me in the past, and maybe many of the people on this list, I think, made a tactical mistake in that they didn't do what I did.
Due to the increased violence in Egypt and Syria and generally the Arab Middle East in recent years, there is some concern that regions such as Caucasus are being neglected by U.S. policymakers. Would you agree with such sort of assessment?
Not really. I mean, I think you go to these capitals in the Caucasus, Tbilisi, Baku, Yerevan, and you see now a very, strong presence on the ground, which was never there before. You see huge embassies, several hundred people, and I think that's where the work is being done. It's being done working in the societies, working with people. I think if the Caucasus is on President Obama's desk, it's usually for a wrong reason. It's problems with between Georgia and Russia, or Armenia and Azerbaijan. So if it's not on his desk, that's probably good news. So I don't believe in this idea that somehow the US is not paying attention to the Caucasus. There are plenty of people who are paying attention, and if there's a crisis, there are plenty of people who will give some good advice.
You recently visited Armenia and you came back from that country, I'm sure, with a lot of impressions. What impressions would you like to share that you think would be of interest to the Azerbaijani audience?
Well, I think a few impressions. One, I think there's a big gap, and I think this is true not of Armenia, just of Armenia, but of Georgia and Azerbaijan as well. Big gap between the capital and the provinces. Yerevan is now quite a pleasant place to live. It's everything works. There's transport, there's infrastructure, there's cafes, there's shops, there's employment. But outside Yerevan, things are really very bad. That's one impression. The other impression politically is that Armenia is, as it were, a kind of smaller version of Ukraine. That both the European Union and Russia are asking them to choose between an association agreement on one hand and a customs union on the other. And Armenia doesn't want to choose. It knows that Russia is its main security ally, and also believes that its kind of economic future lies more with Europe. So Armenia doesn't want to choose, but unfortunately both Brussels and Moscow are putting pressure on Armenia to choose. And I think there's a lot of unhappiness with Russia over the arms deal with Azerbaijan, President Putin's visit to Baku. There's a feeling that Russia is playing games with them in Armenia, which obviously they don't like.
Mr. Duval, do you intend to go to Azerbaijan? If so, when?
Yeah, I do plan to go to Azerbaijan later this year. I decided to wait till after the elections, when people will have a bit more time for me. The new edition of my book on the Karabakh conflict, Black Garden, is now out, so I'd like to do an event in Baku. So maybe before the end of the year, I definitely like to go to Baku to take the temperature of the country after the elections and talk about Karabakh and the book, and if there are any new ideas on this very old conflict.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Duval.
Thanks very much.